to admit I slightly regretted my choice of title when it was printed on the programme. It kind of sounded funny at the time. But I hope the reference to bumping off grandma at least kind of leapt off the page at you. I will say more seriously, I will be talking about some quite distressing subjects in my talk, suicide and terminal illness. If anyone is upset or distressed by anything I talk about, please don't deal with it alone. We have a counsellor with us. Margaret Carter is at the back. If you want to talk to someone, please don't be shy. Do go and speak to Margaret. I think it's very clear from the conspicuous media support for assisted suicide and the sort of mood you pick up on social networking sites and things when the subject of euthanasia comes up, that there is a huge populist support for a change in the law. When you get into debates, and I hope you get into lots of debates, you should be arguing with everybody, argue with your friends, argue with your enemies. Let's keep the debate roaring. But you will probably find it is in fact harder in some ways to argue against euthanasia even than abortion, because on the face of it at least, euthanasia appears to involve a consenting adult doing something to themselves without involving another innocent life. And there will certainly be individuals who would support euthanasia and oppose abortion for that very reason. However, the whole premise upon which people support the right to die is a false one, down to its very name. I'm from a literary background, I'm a wordsmith, I'm a writer by profession. I'm very interested in the way we use language to frame debates, the way we seek to influence public attitudes to certain issues through the very careful use of particular words. I don't really believe there is in fact such a thing as an idle comment. Words have power. They always have a certain premeditation to them. There's always a reason why we use particular turns of phrase. So when it comes to this debate, the first lie is in the name. Right to die is a clumsy misnomer. This debate is not about the right to die. It was never about the right to die. There's a very straightforward reason for this, and it's the same reason the Universal Declaration of Human Rights talks about a right to life, but omits to mention a right to die. You don't need a right to go through a process you're doomed to go through as a consequence of being a human being. Every single one of us in this room is doomed. I won't try and do a Scottish accent and say we're doomed because my Scottish colleagues will throw haggis at me or something. But you know what I mean, Dad's Army. But we're all going to die. Face it, we don't need permission from Lord Falconer or Lord Joffrey or Sarah Wotton of Dignity in Dying to shuffle off this mortal coil. It's about the right to be killed. Doesn't have quite such a compassionate or empowering ring to it. But that's what we're talking about. Campaigning for the right for somebody to end our lives for us. Nor are we even really talking about a right to commit suicide, which is where the term assisted suicide does not really make a great deal of sense either. There is no such right under English law. Suicide was decriminalised years ago, but it was not established as a right. It used to be a crime. But it was understood that people who attempt suicide need help, not punishment. It was compassionate. But it was not established as a right. We make strenuous efforts to stop people from committing suicide. You know, we put nets under suicide spots. We limit the number of paracetamol you can buy. We suicide-proof electrical items. We train negotiators to talk people out of ending their lives. I've had to call the police before when I saw someone about to jump off a motorway bridge. I could hear the sirens blaring as I was still on the phone. They were there in under a minute. You know, deep down, not only do we not believe that suicide is a right or a form of empowerment, we understand it to be a tragedy which should be prevented. If you are fit and healthy, there is a catch. Hold that thought, I will return to it later. But when an individual, a doctor, a nurse, a carer, assists a person, in inverted commas, to take their own life, in some respects, it turns a suicide into a homicide. Assisted suicide sounds a little bit like holding a door open for somebody, helping an old lady off the train, doing someone some little act of kindness to help them along the way. But suicide, by definition, is something somebody does to themselves. So if a third party becomes involved with that process, it has a tendency to blur that distinction between suicide and homicide. And the third party is not assisting anyone, they are colluding in the ending of a human life. And that's before we get to the really insidious euphemism, being put to sleep. If it were an animal, you'd put it to sleep. How many people have heard that? If it were my dog, yes. Right, we're not animals. And death is not sleep. That's the way romantic poets talk about it, not doctors or legislators. You don't wake up. Basic point. And it may not be as peaceful or as effortless as the natural act of falling asleep. Many people who support euthanasia are not aware of how often it fails. The terrible cases of people left fighting for breath, convulsing, slipping in and out of coma, or hell's last horror itself, being put to sleep through slow dehydration. The withdrawal of food and fluids to bring about the death of a patient is legal in this country, as you will have discovered this weekend. It's unfortunately not the case that euthanasia is entirely banned. Active euthanasia, such as by lethal injection, which is what most people mean when they say the word euthanasia, is mercifully illegal. But passive euthanasia, that is a deliberate omission with the intention of killing, which is morally equivalent, they both involve ending a life, is already on the statute books. Are there any Liverpool supporters in this room? Anyone here? Oh gosh, not as many as I expected. Right, I've just alienated the rest of the audience. Okay, well, I hate football myself, I have to admit, but my family are Malta's most passionate Liverpool supporters. And even though I still haven't a clue what the offside rule is, I do know all the words to the Liverpool football song. But this is going somewhere. I can never bear to hear it. I can never hear it all the way through to the end, because it brings back such strong flashbacks to a particular football match many years ago when I was at primary school. It was Liverpool versus Nottingham Forest, FA Cup semi-finals, when BBC was filming live the football match, and it very quickly became obvious to everyone who was watching that we weren't watching a football match at all. We were watching Britain's greatest, most terrible football disaster occurring before our eyes. Through my mind, whenever I hear the words of "You'll Never Walk Alone," I see those images again as if they were happening in real time. The people being crushed against the railings and the injured and the dead being carried onto the pitch. It was, of course, the day of the Hillsborough disaster. The final death toll of that terrible day was 96. Many hundreds of others were injured. There were many injustices connected with that day, but one of the casualties was Tony Bland, young man, boy, who was crushed against those railings during the stampede, and he was starved of oxygen. He was declared to be in a persistent vegetative state, which I have to say I think is an unfortunate term, in my opinion. I don't like it as an expression. But there was later a court case, 1992, there was a court case in which the courts determined it was lawful for Tony Bland's food and fluids to be removed so that he would starve and dehydrate to death. His tube feeding was removed with the intention that he would die, and he duly died. Henceforth, food and fluids have been treated as medical treatment, not as basic care. Now, feeding someone, giving them water, is basic care. It's humane behaviour. But we now have a situation in which countless vulnerable people in hospitals around this country have had their lives ended by the removal of food and fluids. And I think some of the reason that people don't really object to this as much as they should is they have no idea what it actually involves to dehydrate a person. During my last pregnancy, I experienced a condition known as hyperemesis gravidarum. It's an extreme form of vomiting and nausea. You're overwhelmed by sickness constantly for months. It's quite a dangerous condition for that reason. It's thought, in fact, that Charlotte Bronte died of hyperemesis. They couldn't put her on a drip in those days. I couldn't even swallow my own saliva. And during the worst episode, I was without fluids for 5 days. And it was the worst 5 days of my entire life. It is very difficult to describe what happens to you, the horrors you go through when you start dehydrating like that. The hunger reflex will suppress itself quite quickly. You stop feeling hungry if you stop eating. You cannot suppress the thirst reflex. That's why you get these horrible stories sometimes of people who are trapped in the desert who try to drink their own urine because you'll try and drink anything. People get so desperate, so tormented by thirst. You start to break down physically, mentally, emotionally, even dare I say it, spiritually after just a few hours. Your blood pressure crashes. Your mouth and lips crack and bleed. Your insides feel as if they're burning. Your heart races. You start slipping in and out of consciousness. You feel panicky and paranoid. Your memory starts to go. I remember being too weak to open my eyes or speak above a whisper, struggling to talk, only to get halfway through the sentence and I couldn't remember what I'd been saying. First of all, if I hadn't been pregnant, I think I probably would have begged someone to put me out of my misery, not because I wanted to die, but because there comes a point where you can't take it anymore. There's nothing humane about dehydrating a person. Human ingenuity could never devise a method of execution crueler than that. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. So I don't campaign against the withdrawal of food and fluids from patients because I am, in the words of a certain archbishop who will remain nameless, one of those SPUC emotional lunatics who make us all look moderate. It's because I will never forget how it felt to be unable to say the words, "In the name of God, somebody give me something to drink." Some years ago, there was a documentary about Adam Brooks Hospital. Is there anyone from Cambridge here? Losers didn't come. Right. Adam Brooks Hospital is a top teaching hospital with a specialist unit for patients with severe brain injuries. And there was a young man brought in during the time that a documentary was being filmed called Richard Rudd. And he'd suffered catastrophic head and spinal injuries due to a motorbike accident. He was completely paralysed, he couldn't swallow, he couldn't blink, he couldn't breathe unaided. And his family said he was a keen biker, he knew about the risks, and he had always said, was very clear about this, if he became incapacitated as a result of an accident, he would not want to be kept alive like that. And the doctors were inclined to agree with them. There was no suggestion the family had some bad reason for wanting him to die. They were distraught about it. But they wanted to do what they felt he would have wanted. But a sharp-eyed consultant noticed that Richard could move his eyes and therefore could answer questions yes or no by moving his eyes to left or right. So over a period of weeks, Richard was asked a series of ever more complex questions about his family, about his preferences, his hobbies, and they would change the questions slightly to see just how compos mentis he was. They'd say, do you have a daughter called Sarah? And the next day they'd say, is your daughter called Jane? Just to check he wasn't just giving the same responses. And over a period of weeks, the questions got more and more complex, and they realised, in fact, he was completely conscious, contrary to what they thought. He was completely conscious, his memory was intact, and he was, in fact, in full possession of the mental faculties. So in the end, they asked him what he wanted. 3 times they asked him, do you want to continue treatment? And he answered, yes. Family commented afterwards, having been very much in favour of removing life support, that sometimes you just don't know how you might feel. You don't know what's going to matter to you in those situations. And Professor David Menon, who's the head of that unit and looked after Richard's care, said, "We know there may sometimes be big differences between what a patient declares when he's fit and healthy and what he feels when he's the one in the hospital bed. Be careful of the assumption that there is always a settled wish to die." However, none of this really answers the question, can the right to die cause a duty to die? And that's quite a statement to make. Excuse me. Yeah. Is that really fair? Because superficially at least, the idea of might there be a duty to die flies in the face of everything that the euthanasia movement claims to believe and hold sacred, namely autonomy. In fact, some years ago, I heard a doctor at a parliamentary meeting say that in the 1980s, the emphasis was always on ending unbearable pain with the compassion argument. But then in more recent years, there's been a shift in emphasis towards ideas of autonomy. And there was general agreement about that the shift was quite obvious. And there are a number of reasons for that. The first reason may be our fault, as it were. The fact is, unbearable pain carries very little water now as an argument. Palliative care specialists are very quick to point out that modern pain control is excellent. And I think the pro-life movement's been quite effective in countering the argument that euthanasia is necessary for that reason. So the shift may be tactical. Necessity did not work, so we changed the emphasis to autonomy instead. The other factor I think is more straightforward. With the obsessive focus on personal autonomy and choice, it's almost inevitable that the rhetoric of choice would start to creep into the euthanasia debate sooner or later. And it may be a coincidence that the current director of a prominent pro-euthanasia organisation, Sarah Wotton, was a founder member of abortion rights. It's just a coincidence. But increasingly, there's actually very, very little difference in the use of language. My body, my life, my death, my choice, my autonomy, my dignity, my right to take control, my way. Whose life is it anyway? Mine. And so for the most part, if you say, well, could there ever be a duty to die? It'll be shot down pretty quickly. It's preposterous, we would never allow that in a society. Euthanasia is about patient choice, it's about empowerment. Duty to die is absolutely anathema to the very foundations of the euthanasia movement. Indeed, it's quite noticeable that supporters of change in the law tend to quote John Stuart Mill's harm principle. Is a major justification. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of the civilised community against his will is to prevent harm to others. And later, over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. Very obvious shades there of my body, my life, my right to decide. As a quick digression, simply because John Stuart Mill's quote gets used all the time within this debate, if you haven't come across the harm principle before, you certainly will. Firstly, neither society nor the law acknowledges an absolute liberty of self in all cases, in all sorts of spheres. There are some things that happen in 50 Shades of Grey that are technically illegal, in this country at least. But a point that isn't really made perhaps often enough is that when a person ends his or her life, particularly with the collusion of another, someone other than that individual will always be harmed. Even if you used that idea, even if you accepted the idea of the harm principle, the loneliest man on this planet, with no family, no friends, no contacts, very few people, mercifully, are quite that isolated, but even the loneliest man in the world who went to a deserted place and killed himself would hurt someone else by doing so, even if it was the person who stumbled upon their body. Someone has to deal with it. So the harm principle, in my opinion, falls down because no one, even the very lonely, exists entirely in a vacuum. But these difficulties notwithstanding, you don't have to dig very deep to see that for all the talk of liberty, duty is the stronger compulsion when it comes to euthanasia and suicide, and it always has been. The obsessive exaltation of the self and of control may be a modern phenomenon, but tragically suicide certainly isn't. And as you saw yesterday with Adrian's presentation, the rights and wrongs of suicide have been debated for centuries. How many people here have heard of Thomas More's Utopia? How many people have read it? It's a gripping read. Everyone should read it. It's great. It was written in the early 16th century at the time of the first European voyages of exploration. 1492 was not so far before that. And it describes an apparently perfect society, described by a returned traveller who's witnessed the society in action. It goes into all sorts of detail, the dress code, the status of women, the raising of children. But one of the most famous passages describes the terminally ill. More writes, "If any have torturing, lingering pain without hope of recovery or ease, the priests and magistrates repair to them and exhort them, since they're unable to proceed with the business of life, are become a burden to themselves and all about them, and have in reality outlived themselves. They should no longer cherish a rooted disease, but choose to die, since they cannot live but in great misery. Being persuaded, if they thus deliver themselves from torture or allow others to do it, they shall be happy after death. Later, those who are wrought upon by these persuasions either starve themselves or take laudanum. But no one is compelled to end his life thus, and if they cannot be persuaded to it, the former care and attendance on them is continued." I had lecturers, when I was a student, pontificate most solemnly on the subject of why Thomas More, that Catholic martyr, was in favour of euthanasia. In his perfect society, mercy killing was acceptable, so More was a hypocrite, or a daring dissident, or just having a laugh. The whole point of More's Utopia is it's an enormous humanist joke. Except that most people these days aren't in fact humanist in the original sense of the word, or have much of a sense of humour. It means no place. And the name of its narrator translates as liar. You know, it's not even subtle, actually. And if you read the passage carefully enough, it's pretty obvious. "The priests and magistrates repair to them and exhort them, since they're unable to proceed with the business of life." Does that sound like compassionate language? They've really outlived themselves. So Thomas More is not, as some commentators claim, very much in line with modern thinking. He's having a laugh at their expense, because there's clearly nothing remotely compassionate about impressing upon someone a duty to die. But it's very interesting that More chose to satirise that idea, because the idea of having a duty to die is a very ancient one. It's pre-Christian, and in fact it can be found in many non-Western cultures as well, particularly, say, Japan. And even in the Christian West, the idea, even though suicide itself is very taboo, the idea that a man might sometimes be required to end his life as a matter of honour persisted in a small way right into the 19th and early 20th centuries. There's the legendary response to a man who, through cowardice or treachery or general wickedness, had brought his regiment or his family into disrepute, being shown into a room with a bottle of whiskey and a revolver. A sort of British form of falling on your own sword. Better that way than ending your life in front of a firing squad or losing your reputation. Come on, old chap, just do the decent thing. I have to say I wasn't going to mention the Nazi euthanasia programme in this context because I've always felt that what happened to Germany under the Nazis was so horrific, it doesn't really warrant comparison with anything else. But the other day I was at Portsmouth University and someone coldly stated from the audience that some people are just less valuable than others, and therefore it is okay to kill them for the good of others, preferably by abortion to stop them wasting any resources. And when Uju, who was with me, asked, said, "Well, hang on a second, are you saying someone who's blind, who's disabled, is less valuable?" She just went, "Yes." And then when someone behind her went, hang on a second, it's the facts, okay? It's just the facts. And when I encounter people like that, it really makes me feel perhaps the attitudes that allowed over 300,000 sick and disabled people to be murdered through the Nazi euthanasia programme, in many cases by medical professionals, is not quite so distant from our own world, after all. Nazi propaganda posters drew the public's attention repeatedly and persistently to the financial burden of caring for the chronically sick, why the country would be so much better off without them. But it was not a Nazi doctor who came out with the words that caused such shock yesterday. If you're demented, you're wasting people's lives, your families' lives, and you're wasting the resources of the National Health Service. That was the Lady of Darkness herself, Baroness Warnock. She goes on, the last service the state could do me would be to provide such facilities, death facilities. It's argued that such provision might make elderly people feel they have a duty to die. So it should. We should all consider how we can continue to demand that limited resources should be spent on keeping us alive just for the sake of it. Now, the fear of being a burden is a very real problem for people struggling with terminal illness, disability, or mental health problems. The fear, real or imagined, that it would be better for family members not to be faced with the financial and personal costs of caring for a sick person. I say real or imagined because one of the most dangerous sides of the burden issue is that the person concerned may not be a burden at all, the family may not see it that way, but the person may interpret behaviour as meaning that, or the family may send off signals without intending to. Indeed, when a House of Lords committee was asked to look into the possibility of changing the law in the 1990s, it urged unanimously against a change in the law, specifically because of the fear of coercion. The committee warned, we concluded it was virtually impossible to ensure that all acts of euthanasia were truly voluntary, that any liberalisation of the law in the United Kingdom could not be abused. We were also concerned that vulnerable people, the elderly, lonely, sick or distressed. That is a big category, by the way. The elderly, lonely, sick or distressed would feel pressure, whether real or imagined, to request early death. As pro-life writer and campaigner Wesley Smith warns, when a scared and depressed patient asks for poison pills and their doctor's response is to pull out the lethal prescription pad, it confirms the patient's worst fears, that they're a burden, that they're less worth loving. Hospices were geared to address such concerns, but effective hospice care is undermined when a badly needed mental health intervention is easily avoided via a state-sanctioned, physician-prescribed overdose of lethal pills. Sadly, as with so many ethical nightmares in my field, the burden of feeling burdensome within the euthanasia debate falls in the majority of cases to women. Euthanasia may seem more gender-neutral than abortion for obvious reasons. If anything, men may seem to be the more likely targets, as more men, by a long way, commit suicide than women. But within the world of assisted suicide, women, not men, may well end up being the principal targets. I don't know how many people here have heard of Dr. Jack Kevorkian. He killed 69 people during the 1990s, and the majority of them, 71%, were women. And if we consider the age group that's more likely to be affected by changes in the law on euthanasia, the very elderly, women are going to bear the brunt because, as SCBI pointed out some years ago in its paper, Euthanasia and Women, do take a look at the paper if you get the chance. I can only really quote from it here. Women, by and large, live longer than men in Western countries. Therefore, the majority of older persons are female. Women are more likely to be poor in old age than men, more likely to have taken career breaks and been unable to contribute to pension schemes, more likely to have earned less because of the gender pay gap, regardless of their qualifications. Professor Sylvia Canetto of Colorado State University has argued the taking of one's own life tends to be seen as a masculine act. Thus, mercy killing appears as a more permissible way for women to commit suicide. But as another academic, Sidney Callahan, is quoted as saying, the issue goes much deeper than that. As like it or not, women tend to take on the role of carers within society, much more so than men. Even today, like it or not, women tend to be more involved in, say, the raising of children, for example. So the transition from carer to cared for can be extremely harrowing for women and lead to feelings of worthlessness and frustration. These feelings need to be addressed compassionately, not compounded by creating a culture in which ending one's life is treated as the decent thing to do. The change of status is huge. It's really, really huge. Now, I always remember the day we realised that my grandmother was struggling to cope. She was in the early stages of dementia, and she'd invited the family round for lunch. And she cooked this beautiful lunch, and she laid it out on the table and put the plates out, and she couldn't remember what she had to do next. There was the food, there were the plates, and she just stood there. And someone said, oh, don't worry, you sit down, we'll do it. And she sat down and burst into tears because one of her own children stood in her place and served the meal she cooked. The status of the mother is so important in Maltese culture, and there she was, being downgraded at her own table in her own home because she couldn't cope with something very basic. Role reversals are very, very hard to cope with. Carer to cared for is one of the hardest. And it amazes me how pro-euthanasia campaigners sort of talk so glibly on this subject, either insinuating that the burden argument's irrelevant, it's not really a problem, or somehow we can provide safeguards that will telepathically determine a person's motive and ensure they don't feel like a burden and are not choosing euthanasia out of a misplaced sense of duty. In the end, we all fear being a burden to others. Very few people actually want to make a nuisance of themselves, believe it or not. I'm not British. Partly, I think, in British culture, there's a certain nobility attached to not making a fuss and not getting in the way. No, mustn't grumble. No, please don't put yourself to any trouble. No, I don't wish to impose. No, allow me. And it can be quite a strong symptom of depression if you feel as though it would be easier for everyone if you weren't there, or you think you're ruining other people's lives. It can also be quite culturally rooted. Is there really any vulnerable human being in this country who cannot be given the care and support they need to live out the remaining years of their life and die a natural death? Surely not. For someone like Warnock to suggest that there's frankly no place for a person with dementia or any other debilitating condition in the ravaged NHS tent, and they really ought to do the decent thing and take a walk into the blizzard like Captain Oates. I'm just going out for a while, I may be some time. Are we really that desperate? It's dishonest, beyond anything else. Not a lone extremist when it comes to believing there is a duty to die. But ironically, it's our very sophistication, not our lack of resources, that's being used by some proponents of euthanasia to argue the case. John Hardwig, in his essay on the duty to die, argues it is our highly developed society, particularly our advanced medical facilities, that have created a duty to die because, as he puts it, the costs, and they are not merely monetary, of prolonging our lives when we are no longer able to care for ourselves is often staggering. He claims, let me be clear, I certainly believe there is a duty to refuse life-prolonging medical treatment, also a duty to complete advanced directives refusing life-prolonging treatment. But a duty to die can go well beyond that. There can be a duty to die before one's illnesses would cause death, even if treated only with palliative measures. In fact, there may be a fairly common responsibility to end one's life in the absence of any terminal illness at all. Finally, there may be a duty to die when one would prefer to live. Hardwig turns personal autonomy on its head by arguing there's a duty to die and deliberately end one's life because it isn't all about us. We're social animals with families and communities and obligations to society, which is why we should consider opting out. He cites the huge financial and emotional cost of looking after a sick person, but he misses an obvious point. We're human beings. Yes, we're social. We naturally gravitate towards our family unit. We love. We are rational and emotional. We are capable of compassion. To argue it's for the social good to die by euthanasia is to ignore the very basis on which families are built, the intrinsic value of each and every one of its members. Contemplating Hardwick's utilitarian thesis, it's impossible not to be reminded of the stark warning given by the philosopher Immanuel Kant. Man can only dispose of things. Beasts are things in this sense, but man is not a thing, not a beast. If he disposes of himself, he treats his value as that of a beast. He who so behaves, who has no respect for human behaviour, makes a thing of himself. Nobody has much time for the family member who turns up to the wedding, gets drunk, dances the night away, but can't quite bring themselves to make an appearance at a family funeral. Fair weather friends are hard enough to deal with. Fair weather family you can frankly keep. Human life involves both the wedding and the funeral. It involves being at different times, both wholly dependent and wholly the caregiver. But Hardwick makes a much more significant error in creating a dichotomy between personal autonomy arguments and duty arguments within the euthanasia debate. It's not that establishing a euphemistic right to die might create a slippery slope to the duty to die. There is no slippery slope between right and duty. There doesn't have to be one. Those two positions have always coexisted and feed into one another. Not only is it impossible to determine whether a person seeking euthanasia is doing so out of a sense of duty because they feel like a burden, the legalisation of euthanasia presupposes that a certain kind of person is better off dead and should do the decent thing. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that we make efforts to stop people committing suicide. We regard suicide as a tragedy. The catch being that suicide is only a bad thing, as far as society is concerned, if the person is fit and healthy, not if they have a disability or a life-limiting condition of some kind. Janet Thomas, where are you, Janet? Yeah. Oh, I thought you'd missed my talk. There you are. Thank you. Janet, I know some of you went to her workshop earlier. Janet once made the point during a talk about disability. She turned to me and said, "Okay, Fiorella, just imagine you go and see your doctor. You walk into the consulting room and you say to him, 'Doctor, I can't go on anymore. I just don't want to live anymore. My life has no purpose. It's such a struggle. I just want to die.'" The doctor's response would be, "Oh, you shouldn't be thinking like that. No, you're depressed. You're stressed, you need some help. You need a holiday." If Alison Davis, our former colleague, went into the same doctor's consulting room in her wheelchair, with spina bifida, with bulging medical notes indicating her many disabilities, and she said exactly the same words, "Doctor, I can't go on anymore. I just don't want to live anymore. My life has no purpose, it's such a struggle. I just want to die." The chances are that he would at least sympathise with her position. What in a fit and healthy person would present as depression that needs treating, in a disabled person would seem like a perfectly reasonable request. It's a form of disableism, but as a society we don't recognise it as such. Disabled writer and blogger Philippa Willits talks about how often people say to her, "If I were like you, I'd kill myself." Can you imagine actually saying that to someone? I mean, she points out, a society that diminishes our lives to the point that complete strangers tell us we'd be better off dead because some are actually that direct, is one where we're bound to feel like a burden. Every time some celebrity, and there's a growing list of them, is diagnosed with a disabling condition and comes out in a blaze of publicity demanding a change in the law so that they can die with dignity, they unwittingly denigrate the thousands of adults who are living with the very same conditions and don't want to die, and are helping to nurture the idea that it's not only the laudable but the decent thing to end it. It's what strong, courageous, dignified individuals do. Hans Kung, some time ago, talked of his own wish for euthanasia on the grounds he didn't want to be a ghost of his former self. What on earth is that supposed to mean? I mean, is anyone going to admit that they've walked down the street and seen ghosts? I've never met a ghost. It's a figure of speech, a ghost of your former self, it's a shadow of your former self. People do use that term. What exactly is that supposed to mean? My father has Parkinson's disease. It's a degenerative condition that was used as a major emotional thrust to change the law on human cloning some 14 years ago, and it's being used today to try to change the law on euthanasia. That doesn't make him a ghost of his former self. He's no less the man he was a year ago, because he's frailer and he's less mobile. He is who he always was, but with a disability. He's not a ghost of his former self any more than I was a ghost when I was an infant and he had to carry me around because I couldn't walk yet. But I wonder how many people facing diagnoses like that feel emotionally bullied into thinking that euthanasia is the nobler option. It's what the big people do. It's the stoical thing to do. That they should just man up and embrace. The highly influential German doctor, Christoph Wilhelm Huffeland, who at one point was personal physician to the poet Goethe, famously said, "If the physician presumes to take into consideration in his work whether a life has value or not, the consequences are boundless, and the physician becomes the most dangerous man in the state." Tragically, in the century following his death, Huffeland's warning went unheeded in Germany. I wonder if any of the doctors who were hanged or imprisoned following the Nuremberg trials for their part in the murder of millions had even read him. As the first generation of the new millennium, it is your unenviable task to build a culture of life with the right to life and the duty to care for others as its cornerstones. As Mahatma Gandhi is purported to have said, the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. Thank you.